Alright, hey guys, so today we're going to be doing another opening tier list video. This time it's going to be from the white perspective. How do you play against the Nimzo-Indian defense? Which, by the way, is what occurs for those who are not aware. White moves d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, now bishop b4. Probably one of black's best defenses against 1d4, one that I definitely play myself. And the idea basically in this position immediately is to put some pressure on this diagonal, stop white from playing e4, and potentially at some point even take on this square, creating a situation where white will have doubled C pawns. I also made a video 22 concepts every Nimzo-Indian player must know, so if you want to learn the basics of this opening before you want to get into all the details of the theory here and which lines are best and which lines are not, I recommend going to check that video out. I'll try and leave it up in the card somewhere. But as usual, I'm going to be ranking the lines against the Nimzo-Indian from F to S tier. Of course, F being the worst and S being the best stuff that is available, at least in my opinion. But yeah, starting right off with F tier, there are going to be two lines in this tier. The first one is going to be playing e4. And, you know, of course, this move looks a little bit ridiculous at first because black's last move literally just went to controlling the e4 square, and now here we are just playing e4 anyway. But there is sort of a point to this move. A bad point, but there is a point that after knight takes e4, white's going to try play queen g4 and fork this knight and pawn, and if black just retreats, then we're going to take the pawn and kind of pretend like we're not doing so badly. However, the problem is of course that black will take, and if we play queen takes g7 in this position, I don't really think this works. I think black can probably play something like even queen f6, oh no my queen, because we're winning the queen back for discovered attack. So white very often tries to throw in this intermediate move of a3, and the point is that now bishop a5 and you go for this whole thing that we just saw. Now say queen f6 takes, there's b4 actually blocking the check like this, and now we can like win back a piece. But even this position isn't so good, and there's also something to say, which is that black can even just play this better move, bishop e7. And now the point is of course that any queen takes g7 shit is going to be met by bishop f6. And if you take back now, well, we can castle, and after something like bishop d3, white can sort of pretend like maybe they have some sort of attacking play of their bishops on these dangerous looking diagonals, but it all kind of gets shut down with f5. And black is basically just up a pawn. White has pretty much no compensation to speak of, which is why, yeah, like e4, it looks bad and it also is bad, so it goes in the F tier. And the other line that's going to be going into the F tier is where white plays this sort of natural looking move, or move 4, bishop g5. But the sort of problem with this move is, although it looks very natural, you know, pinning the knight on this diagonal, is that sometimes this pin actually doesn't really do anything, and also in certain lines, the bishop can actually be tactically vulnerable on the c5 square. For example, black's best move in this position, I think if they just like castle and, you know, do nothing, not really doing nothing of course, castling, but the best way to play bishop g5, rather the way to put it, is just by playing very directly, once again making use of the fact that this bishop can be tactically vulnerable in some lines. Like already in this position, ideally what white will like to do is play this move e3, but the problem is in this position after queen a5, it doesn't really work. Because, okay, immediately we're threatening to take this and win a pawn, and if say white tries to protect this by playing something like rook c1, it doesn't really work as black can actually just play this nice move knight e4, using the fact that we just brought our queen off of this diagonal, and now not only is bishop under attack, but also we're threatening to, of course, win a pawn if knight takes c3, and that pretty much means white's best move is to take now, but after the following line, they're just going to be ending up down a pawn after something like king e2, g takes f6, and not only are they down a pawn of course, but their king cannot castle. Which is why usually when they face c5, the white is going to play d5, but the whole d5 thing doesn't really combine well with bishop g5. And one reason is that black would aim for a very sort of closed structure by playing, let's say, the following moves like h6 in this position, bishop h4, bishop takes e3 check, and then aiming for some sort of setup where eventually they put a pawn on e5. In this position, they have even more accurate moves like g5, I think, and like say knight e4. There are some nuances we're not going to get into like right now, but they could also just do something like e5 and basically put all their pawns in dark squares, and this bishop kind of does look stupid on this diagonal. Yes, white has a bishop pair, but what's a bishop pair really doing, right? And aside from just that very solid setup that black has, there's another more concrete one where they can take on d5, and after say the following moves, what we essentially have, these are all the best moves I'm showing for white. By the way, it can get even worse if they don't play like this. They sacrifice a pawn, and now after takes, they're not doing too badly, I believe, after something like takes, because they can actually play bishop b5, pin this knight and also attack the d6 pawn. And if we try to like defend it or something like queen e5, it doesn't really save us because this is like really unpleasant now. So the best move actually after b takes c3 is not to take on c3 immediately, is actually to play this in between move c4. And the whole point is that if white, takes it, well, then we get this very nice discovered attack on this bishop over here while simultaneously attacking this bishop, of course, which means that white's just going to win a piece. Sorry, black rather. And if they instead retreat, well, what we're going to do is castle. And basically, we're just going to argue that we're a pawn up. Yes, white has a bishop here, they might have some compensation, but it's very shaky. And the reason we wouldn't just castle, say, immediately in this position is that our knight's actually undefended, and white could exploit that very concretely by taking on h7 and taking the knight like this. Whereas if we play c4, notice how in this variation, they can't really do that because, well, our knight's defended by the queen. So yeah, again, there's multiple problems with bishop g5. If there's one problem with a line, I can sort of let it slip. But when there's more than one, it sort of becomes very questionable. So yeah, bishop g5 definitely, in my opinion at least, goes into the F tier. So now moving on to the C tier, there's going to be two lines in this one. The first one's going to be queen b3. It's very similar actually to a line we're going to see later in a higher tier, which is queen c2. Queen b3 is very similar to queen c2 in some sense, in that if black ever takes, the whole idea of going queen c2 is that if black ever takes, you have the option of not only taking back for the pawn, which you really do once you play queen c2, but instead actually taking back for piece. And by doing that, you manage to avoid getting the doubled c pawns. However, there is sort of a con that comes with this, and very often because you're developing the queen so early into the game, it can be harassed by the black pieces and you can lose a lot of time. But the somewhat interesting thing about queen b3 is that not only are we protecting the knight, but we're also proactively going out of our way to attack the bishop on b4. However, luckily for black, or maybe not so luckily, they have this move c5, which not only protects the bishop on b4, but also puts some pressure on the d4 pawn of white's. The usual reaction how white will handle this sort of thing in the queen c2 line, where after c5 they'll take, and also the queen b3 one is to, well, as well take. And basically, I think if black takes immediately, white can get a somewhat decent position by just sort of developing their pieces naturally, playing like e3, bishop e2. They might get sort of somewhat of a slight edge, which is why this goes in C tier. I can see some potential with this line, but the issue is if black plays even just a little bit more accurately, like even these lines are, somewhat fine for black, but if they play like knight c6 for example, and after knight f3, again not taking, but say playing something like knight e4, putting some pressure on this knight on c3, white is sort of forced to respond bishop d2 to avoid getting like double pawns, let's say takes. Well, now black already has sort of the advantage of the bishop here, and after maybe takes, the position is probably roughly equal, nothing too bad for white. But to be honest, again, just the fact that black has a bishop here to me feels like a rather important long-term advantage, and something that I probably wouldn't want to really play a whole lot if I had the white pieces. So again, queen b3, is it a terrible move? No, it's quite playable actually. But if black is accurate, which to be frank, a lot of players aren't, then I can definitely see how there is some appeal in playing this whole like queen b3 line once again. So on a similar note to what we just looked at, how queen b3 protects the knight in c3 and also avoids getting double pawns, a line that's quite similar is white playing bishop d2. However, what I have to say about this line is that I like it a lot less than, say, playing what I consider to be a more accurate move order, which is playing e3 in this position, castles, and then bishop d2. We're going to be talking about this later, because if we play bishop d2 immediately, it's quite difficult, I think, just to deal with a very quick c5 from black. White doesn't really want to play e3. Well, they sort of have to, I feel like, in this position, because it's either you go like knight f3 and, well, now you sort of get your d pawn traded off for black's sort of less central c pawn. You play d5, which feels quite sketchy, or you take on c5, which is a similar story to knight f3. We don't really want to make this pawn trade that much. So that sort of leaves e3 as the most logical move, but the problem is after just simply like takes, and like I just consider these positions where very often these pawns are going to get traded off at some point to be pretty decent for black. White's going to have an IQP and probably not the best version of it. You can sort of get away with maybe playing c5 as white in some of these positions, but I don't really consider this to be like that amazing. So like castles, a3, something like this, maybe knight e4. Like you can go for this if you want, but personally, I've never seen a big appeal in it. So now moving on to the B tier, these lines are again, a bit better than the stuff in the C tier, but still like not the best stuff in the world. Pretty like mediocre, I would say. So the first line we're going to be looking at is what is called Kasparov variation, and usually you would expect if something is, you know, named after Garry Kasparov, it would probably be in like the S tier. However, unfortunately, that isn't quite the case, and also it's worth noting that when Garry Kasparov played it, the engines weren't as strong as they are now, yada yada yada. But basically, there's no real issue with Knight of 3 per se. It's a sort of a bit of a weird line in the sense that it often morphs into a lot of other lines in the Nimzo-Indian, because by playing Knight of 3, it's a very flexible developing knight move, of course. There are some lines where, of course, you might want to put a knight in E2 or something like that. But generally, you know, in a lot of lines in Nimzo, a knight will eventually come to this square. So playing it now and not really committing to any like pawn or bishop moves, like maybe you can bring a bishop to G5, maybe you'll lock it in with E3, maybe you'll go for a fianchetto with G3. It's a very flexible move, Knight of 3. And I think these days, like say if black castles, people are often going like bishop G5, and you sort of get a better version of what is called the Leningrad variation, which is playing bishop G5 immediately, because I think black, the very like direct attempts at playing like C5, they don't work quite as well in this variation. Like for example, just to show if we play C5, E3, well, if black tries to play Queen A5, because we have our knight developed on F3, and black is castled, we can actually just take on F6, and if black does try to win a pawn, they sort of end up risking game behind development. Again, the knight being on F3, it's very key. We don't have to move our king to a sort of awkward square where it no longer has castling rights. And now after G takes F6, yeah, black is technically up a pawn for now, but they're very lagging behind development, and white really has a lot of potential in their position. Again, though, that doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with castles. You can also go like C5 immediately, or B6. B6 is quite a solid one, actually. And one of the points now is if white maybe tries to switch to, I don't think bishop G5 quite works as well in this position, because black can play sort of like a quick like H6 and going like G5 or something like this. And if they'd castled, this would be quite weakening, but with the king not castled yet, even actually they do end up castling kingside very often in the future. But there's just some concrete reasons as to why doing this with delayed castling is a bit better. And let's say if instead of bishop G5 you go like E3, well, now one sort of problem is that you can't really get the best version of the B6 lines that you'd get if you played like on E3 move 4 rather, because if B6 in this position, I think what white's very best line is to technically play knight E2 actually, and then play A3 very quickly. Whereas of course if you put a knight on F3 very early on, you no longer have that option. Does that mean this position is bad for white? No. But it's just a matter of, you know, like optimizing for certain things against like certain lines, knowing what you want, knowing what you don't want. If you really like these positions, but you don't like these positions, and like you probably don't want to play knight f3, right? But also probably one of the main lines after knight f3 is to play c5, and usually what white will do in this position is play g3. And this was sort of one of the main concepts of the Kasparov variation. Again, c5 would be playing this, being kettling the bishop on this diagonal. And this variation is actually really interesting. Of course, as in all variations of such a very solid opening as Nimzo-Indian, black is sort of fine if they know what they're doing. And actually, as a matter of fact, this is something that I even like to play a bit a couple years ago. I can't exactly remember why I stopped playing it. I think I was just playing like a bunch of other things at the time, so this sort of fell by the wayside. But also on that note, segmenting into another variation that's also going to be in the B tier, is going to be actually playing G3 immediately on move 4. And this is actually the variation that I was playing. I was getting into that whole variation via black playing C5 and then transposing by playing knight f3 on this move. And you know, there are certain pros and cons to doing it like this. One pro, for example, is that you avoid the B6 lines if you play like say knight f3 B6 here, because this is a very solid line that can be a bit annoying to deal with. If you play G3 in this move, you don't really have to deal with that, because black has to play some sort of weird move like C6 or D5 or knight C6. That's even more strange. However, as the famous saying goes, there's no such thing as a free lunch. You have to take the pros for the cons. And one of the cons, I think, for example, is that black can play one of these lines where they take on C3 very early on, and they can go for, say, like a very quick D6, E5 type thing. And these lines are actually very solid and difficult to crack with the white pieces. However, I don't actually know or think that many people play like this with black. I've done it on a few occasions, but a lot of people actually, at least from what I can understand, go for more like traditional main lines such as C5, or maybe they'll go for like castles, or maybe even just something like D5 actually. This is quite a critical line as well that you need to know if you play this variation, where like there's this whole thing that goes castles, bishop G2, and a lot of people actually don't really know how to play this position with black, at least from what I've observed. they'll go for something like d5 or like c6, all very natural looking moves, maybe even b6. But none are really that good if I'm being honest. The very best one is for them to play d takes c4. And again, people, even in this position, often don't know what they're doing so well. They play like c5 or something, which isn't terrible. None of these moves I mentioned are like losing outright or anything, but the very best way for black to play is to play knight c6 after castle, and aim for this sort of setup where they play rook b8, b5, and aim to hold into their precious c4 pawn like this, where it turns into a very like sharp, interesting, dynamic position with very interesting chances for both sides. And so one of the most important lines actually of the whole Nimzo-Indian is going to be a3. I'm going to be putting this into B tier. Especially in the last few years, a lot of strong players have been playing this. To be honest, I'm not even really exactly too sure what all the trends are. I haven't really been following them too closely, but I think evidence that this line is actually like quite playable is the fact that even, Ding and his match played this against Nepo for the World Championship, where, the whole Rook A2 move happened and whatnot. Though I'll be perfectly honest, I'm not really too sure what the whole trends are after, say, black plays C5. Because the old main line is white plays like E3 or something. They go for this whole line where they try to play it a bit slow, like well, not really slow, I guess, but like, say we get the following position, they'll play E4. Like, there's this whole thing where black is very solid in this position. I don't really think anyone's found anything against this. This is like very well known. It's been around for a long time for black. I've actually managed to play this like exact position on the board with black when I was a bit younger. But I don't know, I think there might be some like weird trends where white tries to play, instead of like this more slow like E3, bishop D3, knight E2, and only then like 10 moves later going for E4, you try to do that more immediately, I think, with like F3 and then E4 or something. Again, it's like white's not necessarily an advantage in these sorts of positions, but I think this is something that people have been trying. Again, I'm not completely up to date in the trends here. I could be slightly off, but in spite of all these trends, I don't think it's enough to be above B tier, but it's also definitely not bad enough that it can ever be like below that in my opinion, which again is like why it comes into the B tier. And of course, like, I might not have properly explained this earlier, but like A3, it really is the most testing line of the Nimzo-Indian in some sense, because if this line works where you immediately try to kick the bishop away, black is forced, they can't just retreat because then E4 and like what was this whole thing, right? You have to take, you give up the bishop here, but now white gets doubled C-pawns. This is really just kind of testing the whole concept of the Nimzo-Indian. If this doesn't really work for black, then the whole Nimzo-Indian is kind of flawed as a whole opening. But anyways, last but not least, we are going to be looking at the final line for the B tier, which is going to be when white plays E3. Not just E3 on move 4 necessarily, this is going to be split up into a couple of different sections. But say after castle, we talked about earlier how like if black plays B6, white's best move is knight E2. Well, actually in a lot of these lines, basically against regardless any next move black plays except d5, because then knight e2 doesn't really make sense because black will take immediately on c4 and it's a little bit difficult to win back this pawn actually. Or also against bishop takes c3 on this move, knight e2 is of course not particularly legal in this position, but against say like any random move like d6, c5, b6, knight e2 is sort of like a very good playable move against all of them. But against castles, this is the whole reason I'm putting this in B tier actually, because a lot of players when they play knight e2, they just sort of play it as a system. They'll do it against no matter what black does, and I don't really think this is exactly the correct approach to have. Like in the past, I would play bishop d2 in this position actually, which we talked about a bit earlier and we're going to be talking about in the A tier. But at the same time, I wouldn't try to play bishop d2 against everything. Like against b6, I'd play knight e2. Against c5, I'd also play, sorry, not here, say c5, knight e2 in this position, because I thought these were the best moves, right? Whereas against castles, it's a little bit more difficult to get an advantage, probably impossible actually. At least, of course, if black does the correct moves, that's always a thing that you have to say, because at the end of the day, again, chess is technically a draw. But nonetheless, in this position, I think knight e2 is definitely a less challenging move. And that's for a couple of different reasons. It's actually 3 good moves that black has in this position. The most direct one is d5. This is also the one that most people will play, and even if they don't know much theory, you can usually equalize just because this whole like setup where black goes knight e2, the whole idea is okay, you'll go a3 in this position, and if black takes, then you have a very solid advantage because you have the bishop here. This is a kind of goal when you play this variation, but very often black isn't going to make your life so easy like this. Instead, after a3, they're going to retreat with the bishop to somewhere like e7. d6 is quite provocative, this is a thing as well. But the general thing you have to understand about these positions is I just don't find these lines particularly challenging. I feel like black can equalize fairly easily. But what you do have in this variation very often is just a complicated game. All the pieces are on the board, and at the end of the day, I guess that's all you can really ask for in a lot of openings. So in that sense, definitely very respectable, very solid, never going to be refuted. But there are some issues, like for example, your knight just being a bit awkward on the e2 square. Very often you try to get around this by like going takes and like knight f4 or something, and the knight's also a bit awkward on f4, to be honest. Sometimes you also go g3 and try to bypass that by, instead of putting the bishop on the most active diagonal where it really wants to be, you'll put it instead in the g2 square, where it's a little bit odd butting heads against the d5 pawn. But again, you might go like f3, e4 sometime in the future. It's playable, but nothing too special. So now moving up to the A tier, we're going to continue on talking about e3 a little bit. In particular, after say castles, playing bishop d2, because again, you might have just come from like the very start of the video and skipped all the other stuff, but I was talking a bit earlier in this video how like black plays c5 or b6 was actually a very accurate move against both of those continuations. Whereas against castles, knight e2, I consider it to be a little bit less strong, and in this position actually there's like kind of bishop d3 that's a main move. But bishop d2 was sort of a bit of a runner-up variation, which has seen a bit of a popularity surge in the last few years. I've definitely played a bit myself. I think the hype has died down a little bit. Black has found a couple decent ways to play against it, but still I think a lot of people aren't really too aware of how to deal with this whole variation, which at the very least in my eyes makes it a pretty decent weapon. Like for example, in this position, if black just plays very directly in the center playing d5, c5, like they actually would in, say, the main line with bishop d3 actually, where this is just very common, I actually don't really consider it to be as strong. It's still very solid, but white can actually play this very accurate move a3 now, and say after takes, we have the bishop here, and if white tries to just go mad in the center and make a bunch of exchanges, I don't really consider this to be something that black should be opposed to. Sorry, white should be opposed to, rather. And at any point, this is also worth pointing out that if black tries to play something like knight e4, a very common move in the Nimzo-Indian, trying to neutralize the advantage of our bishop here, well, we're just sort of going to get, this is actually a position that I had once over the board and a bunch of times online. I think I have a pretty decent score from these positions, where if you make a bunch of exchanges in the center, okay, material is equal, white doesn't have the bishop here, things seem fairly equal, the pawn structure is also quite symmetrical, but we do definitely have just a bit more piece activity, of course, with all black's pieces being on the back rank, whereas we have a rook on c3, a bishop on this diagonal, which is maybe not doing so much at the moment, at the very least an active knight on d4, so there's definitely some things that we can sort of, be happy about with our position. And also, if black plays c5 in this position, I think this is a little bit more critical. This is one of those lines which, let's say this happens, I think rook c1 isn't quite as strong in this exact position. I forget the exact details of why, but usually white will instead play knight e2, and then black will try and say play b6. And I remember this being one of the like really annoying variations that white would have to face in this whole line, where like say if you went d5, black would play bishop a6 and attack the pawn like this, where if you went b3, b5 was a thing. I'm getting really into the weeds of the theory, but again, I guess this is why you guys sort of watch these videos, right? You want to know like all this theoretical stuff that will never happen in your games. But also I should add, just going back to d5 really quickly, this is very important to talk about, this move b6 in this position. For a long time, this is what a lot of books like would recommend against this line, as opposed to c5, because these positions, like say this one I was just showing earlier, this is pretty dry for black. It's not particularly fun. Whereas b6 keeps a lot more of that dynamism in the position. You're keeping a lot more of the pieces on the board. And what white's approach usually is to play like c takes d5, takes, and say either in this position you go bishop d3 or rook c1. This sort of con of bishop d3 theory may have changed, I'm not too sure, is that black will play bishop a6 and just exchange off these bishops. White's light squared bishop of course being the good one, so black generally speaking is going to be okay with this trade, which is the whole point of playing like rook c1. Actually, this is what I played when I played the variation. The point being that now if black plays bishop a6, well, we can just take in one go, and well, we have the same position that we would have if we take in this position, except we have a rook on c1. So usually black, if they get this position, they're not going to go bishop a6, and instead go like bishop b7, bishop d3 will happen, say like knight bd7, and if say white castles, one trick actually is that if black goes rook e8, I had this in quite a lot of blitz games actually, that we'll play knight b5, and now you attack this bishop and also the pawn on c7, which forces black to more or less take, and after knight takes d2, black actually has no way of defending this pawn on c7. If they go like rook c8, then they hang the pawn on a7. And if they move the pawn to like c6 or something, well then like this happens and we win a piece. And it's technically more complicated than that because black can sort of try and trap the knight here, but doesn't really work. Which is why in this position, usually instead of something like rook e8, which has a point of covering the e5 square, if a6 stopping knight b5, well then white will make use of the fact that with black's last move, they once again neglected that e5 square and will go for something like knight e5. And basically our whole idea is that if black just plays any random move, we're going to play f4 next, and we sort of construct what's very often known as like a Pillsbury attack sort of setup where we have a knight in e5, we shove a pawn up to f4. And one very nice idea that's very typical in this variation is we'll go bishop e1 to h4, maneuvering the bishop to this diagonal where it is incredibly difficult for black to deal with. And in fact, black is sort of much worse already in this position. Well, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but at least in practice, it does sort of feel like that. The other line which is going to be going into the A tier is going to be white playing queen c2 move 4. Again, we mentioned this earlier in the C tier when we were briefly talking about queen b3, a very similar move. But queen c2, definitely one of the most principled moves against Nimzo. It's definitely one that I played a bit when I was younger. It was actually the first time I really made a real repertoire against 1d4. This is what I was playing against the Nimzo. And of course it has a very clear benefit that it's sort of easy to understand. Your ideas like you'll go a3, black will probably take at some point, you'll take back, you have the bishop pair, and now you're going to have a lot of fun. In theory, that, how can work a lot of the times. However, the sort of problem is like, okay, if you go c5, for example, these lines I've always considered to be very pleasant for white. Very often we're going to get like a knight to f3, a bishop to g5, will just develop very harmoniously. Never had a problem with these lines. I've always liked them a lot for white, the c5 ones. But say if, black plays castles in this position, d5 is also actually a very solid line. Like even c5, there's probably nothing objectively wrong with it, just stylistically I've liked it. But one problem is that if say black castles immediately, is that there's a very modern, tough to crack line which was sort of introduced by Kramnik. I'm not sure when, but I know it was introduced by Kramnik, that's all I know. Where instead of going like b6 and going for this very like slow stuff that a lot of people used to do, I think like Anatoly Karpov used to play his way with black a lot. Nothing wrong with it, I think it's perfectly playable actually. But Kramnik's solution was just going d5, and then going d takes c4 and b6, trying to get the bishop to a6, playing c5, which is very often a pawn sacrifice in many lines. It's very concrete, very forcing, and it's basically just impossible for white to get an advantage in these lines. You can try, there've been some people who've tried to do some stuff, like I remember Kasparov and some like Blitzfin at St. Louis a couple years ago, he tried playing like h4. But yeah, this whole line, very difficult to crack. A lot of people play it these days as well, because like this is what every like opening book basically recommends for black. But there are some other things you can do, like say after castles, you don't have to play a3, you could play like knight f3 as well. And say if black plays d5, you could transpose to the whole thing we just mentioned by playing a3 if you really want to. Or you can go for like c takes d5 and bishop g5, and you get some sort of offshoot of the Queen's Gambit decline exchange variation. But it's sort of okay for black if they play very accurately, I think. Like if they just play slow moves, they sort of get a bad version of the Queen's Gambit decline exchange variation because the bishop is on b4 and it should be on e7. But if they play concretely using the fact the bishop is on b4, they can, like in this position, play like a quick h6 and go c5. And they're more or less doing okay in these sorts of positions, not really much for white. But also, like say if instead of knight f3 they go c5, like even these lines are pretty okay, I think. Again, usually the reaction to c5 that white's going to do is to play d takes d5, and if black plays very accurately with knight a6, yeah, in general, like these lines, there's some like theory you need to know, but I've never, to be honest, been like too like overly impressed with white's chances in this whole variation. Like usually you'll get something like g3 takes, knight c4, castles, takes, like it's a doubled c pawns, but they get like e4, say d6 happens, and you get this sort of like weird position where black is sort of like pretty okay, but white does arguably just have a little bit of pressure. Like say if knight d7, bishop f4, some exchanges. Even if these bishops do get exchanged off the board, white sort of always has this Catalan bishop on this diagonal, whereas black has a bit of a tough time getting their one out. Or if instead of going knight f3, which was the whole rabbit hole again that we were sort of going down in case you forgot, is to play e4 in this position. But again, sort of like the a3 lines where, black can sort of be okay, like in a very concrete manner. I sort of get the same impressions from the e4 lines. I'd say the threshold of fear which black needs to know is a little bit higher than the a3 ones, in the sense that if they forget one move, in these lines, to be honest, I've never got the impression that you know, black, if they forget one move, like it's over for them, they're gonna die. Whereas the e4 lines, you sort of do get a bit of that impression. Yeah, again, this is a position where now they play e4, black plays d5, e5, knight e4, and you get some stuff like bishop d3, c5, and the main line sort of continues knight f3, takes, knight d7, and now bishop f4. The old main line was like they went knight c5, but these days it's considered like more accurate to actually just play queen h4. And to be honest, this whole variation is very sharp and sort of risky for both sides. But personally, it's never really been something that really I was too interested, but that's probably more of like a personal bias. I just don't really like these super sharp positions where you need to know like all this precise theory. That's not really my style, to be honest. So now finally, we're going to be talking about the S tier. These are, in my opinion, the two lines we're going to be talking about now, the very best. So we're going to be talking about e3 again, and we've talked about various setups through the duration of this video where, like, you know, after castles we'll go knight e2, we can go bishop d2, but the one which I believe is sort of S tier materials where you go bishop d3, and this can sort of be once again split up into multiple lines, but I was kind of too lazy to do that, to be honest, especially since it really depends on black's next move, what happens. Like, the stuff that white can do after d5, or say like black playing c5, it does vary a little bit, and also the strength of those moves. So to split this up into like 6 different sections when I can just have it as one and then sort of individually explain like what I think is good from here and what I think is not good, to me, that at least made more sense. Maybe that's just me trying to be lazy, but basically what you have to understand is that after d5, say for example, there's a couple different options. I think probably the best option is to go like say knight f3, but again, objectively, like everything sort of leads to equality eventually. Knight f3 is also probably going to be the most studied move. You can go c takes d5 and go like knight e2. You could also go knight e2 immediately. I'm not so much a fan of these variations actually, because black can take very quickly and then go for like this sort of isolated queen's pawn position where the knight is weakly placed on e2. It's playable, but personally I was never a big fan of this sort of stuff for white. Whereas after c5, actually I'd say that this is a little bit better, this variation, because now if black tries to go for the isolated queen's pawn thing, we can sort of deflect it a little bit, and after takes, go castles, and if knight c6, now take on d5. And black has a bit of an option. They can either take and go into this position where it's very symmetrical, but white has a sort of slight advantage just because, you know, the position, well, it's symmetrical, and given that white is sort of like a move ahead in some sense, that does give them a little bit of something to play with. Or if black goes queen takes d5, this comes with its own risks, putting the queen out where it's a bit vulnerable. Very often white's going to go for some sort of like quick a3 thing, the bishop moves somewhere, then you go queen c2, hit the pawn h7, and also sort of flirt with bishop e4 ideas to, you know, once again kick this queen around on the vulnerable d5 square. But the sort of evergreen approach which can be used regardless of whether black plays d5 or c5 in this whole variation is on the next move basically just to put a knight in f3, like say after knight f3, because very often what you have to understand is that like there are some independent options in both of these variations if black plays d5 or c5, but very often like regardless it will just transpose either in this fashion or once again like this, and once again c5. And to be honest, I've played this a bit, never quite over the board, but just via the sheer amount of possibilities and richness of the positions, these are positions which have been analyzed a lot, but unlike say with the queen c2 variations we were just talking about in the A tier, a lot of those lines feel like they can sort of be analyzed out very easily. Maybe not easily, but they have been analyzed out to like very forcing conclusions, because that's just sort of the nature of the lines, where as with the e3 lines, because they're a lot more subtle and positional, strategic, whatever you want to call it, in nature, that does lend to this sort of making them more difficult to really completely figure out, and that also means that you can sort of rely more on sort of your natural abilities and trying to like outplay the opponent, where it's not necessarily dictated by how much forcing theory do you know, but again, just like how well do you actually understand the positions in front of you. However, in spite of the fact, you know, I'm putting this A tier, there really is a lot to learn, sorry, S tier rather, there really is a lot to learn about these lines. Like, for example, if you castle, you have to learn a lot of variations just in this position. There's the carpal variation, there's maybe knight c6, or if you just go back a couple moves, you can go knight c6. This is a very kind of important line. There's takes, knight c6. There's even this like backing line, bishop d7, I think. And in this position, you know, white can do some stuff without c5, white can go b6. There's a lot of lines you need to study if you really want to play this whole thing. Maybe not, depending on your level. Like if you're 1600, you can just sort of play natural developing moves and sort of get away with the fact that your opponents also aren't really going to know that much more theory than you. But definitely for those of you who are at a higher level, it's worth taking into consideration that yeah, not only is this something which your opponents will have studied a fair bit because it's one of the main lines of the Nimzo-Indian, but something which you're going to have to study probably a lot more because, well, not only you're going to have to know the lines which your opponent plays, but you're going to have to know like that plus like 10 different more ones, just because that's how like flexible and rich this position is. Not necessarily a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing, just sort of how it is. And for the final line in this video, I want to talk about the one which I think for many of you watching might be like the most challenging line for your opponents to face, especially at sort of the amateur level, at the master level, like grandmaster, whatever. It's debatable, right? I'm not at that level, neither are you guys, most likely at least. So I'm not necessarily discussing it from that angle. But at least combining all these like objective and practical factors, in my opinion, the line that deserves to be in S tier is going to be the F3 variation, where white aims to play very ambitiously by playing E4 on the next move. I have to admit, this is always a variation which I've never quite played myself as white, but definitely as a Nimzo-Indian player, at times has definitely been very annoying to deal with myself. And black has a couple different options in these positions. For example, the main ones are D5 and C5. D5 is sort of the one that I've played for a long time, where after A3 you'll take and go C5. And one very important thing to understand is that after C takes D5, black's by far best moves to play knight takes D5. Well, to be honest, that might be a bit of a loaded statement, loaded with personal subjectivity, but E takes D5, I've never liked these structures for black. I think one option is to go like C4 or something. I think like Sparov might have tried to play this at one point in his career, where you play in a very concrete way. You like try to slide knight into the B3 square, you try to limit white's counterplay of E4. Very complicated positions actually, but very often how it actually looks in practice between two like random club players is black will castle, white will play bishop D3, they'll play knight in E2, they'll eventually play E4. They have the bishop pair, big center, and black actually just has nothing to show for what they've done in the opening. Which is why I think knight takes D5 is, I mean, I think most people who've studied a bit of theory play this way. White will play D6, C5, and there's two sort of main approaches. One is Queen A5, one is F5. And I think technically both black is sort of doing okay, but they have to be very accurate. And if you really study your theory as white, I think you can pose a lot of black players problems, because the thing is with F3 is that although it's very critical, you have to understand this compared to some other variations like say Queen E2 or E3, it's not as common. Because of that, it's not as very well like or meticulously studied as some of those other variations. But also the problem is that because F3 is such a concrete line, if you don't really know the theory very well in those variations as black, you can very easily end up in a lot of trouble. But also the other sort of main approach after F3 is to go C5, and there's a lot of lines where black can play a quick B5 and sort of play in somewhat of a style reminiscent of the Benko Gambit, and those are some very good lines objectively, but the sort of con of those lines is that although they're good objectively, it sort of plays into our hands as what we want with the white pieces. We want a position that's very messy, chaotic, which very often Nimzo-Indian players, like, some of them are okay with that, but a lot of them, at least like for players like me, sort of want that more like calm sort of positional game where you can outplay your opponent. This sort of very chaotic vibe, it's not really personally my thing. A lot of other Nimzo-Indian players, it's also not really their thing. And then there's also some like other random lines where black can, I don't know, go for like knight 6 and try to go for quick E5 or something like that. Those lines you have to study. They're not technically as critical, but you sort of have to know what you're doing, because there are some theoretical shortcuts like that where black will try and trick you into some like weird position that is actually not too bad for them necessarily. I think like knight 6 is something I've played in the past. For example, one point just to show you would be like if E4, E5, that something like D5 I think would play into black's hands, because either you're going to go like knight D4 and knight would be quite annoying here, or you can go for something like say takes, and have a very typical Nimzo-Indian position where white has, you know, these double C pawns, which means that in this position probably a more accurate move would be to play this subtle move A3, ignoring the tension here right now, but instead striving to get this position where you have not yet committed the pawn to D5, and you sort of argue that this version of the double pawns is a little bit better than say this one that I just showed, whereas this one earlier. But again, I could make another video just dedicated to this, solely this whole like F3 Nimzo thing, or any other of the variations made in this video. If there's any in particular that you're interested in, please let me know down below in the comments. But again, you know, these videos, these tier list ones, there's supposed to be more of a broad overview. I give you like the most critical lines against all the variations. I show you how things can sort of end up well in certain scenarios. But yeah, of course, as usual, you know, if you enjoyed the content, please leave a like, subscribe if you enjoyed it, and also check out my stuff in the description below, my free newsletter, coaching, and also the Discord if you want to come and chat with some of the other guys in the community. But you know, with that being said, I hope you guys have a good day, and I will see you until next time.